Good evening. Spirited. Welcome to Respond to Racism. This is our monthly community meeting. I'm very excited to be in conversation tonight with Sarah Sanderson and Taylor Stewart. And before I introduce our guests, my name is Bruce Poinsett. I'm the Executive Director of RtR. And just want to do a few announcements before we get started. So first off, the Gloria Brown Scholarship is now officially open through April 15th. It's open to BIPOC seniors who reside in Lake Oswego, so that's not just students who go to Lake Ridge or LOHS, but also if you reside in LO and go to other schools but are a graduating senior, the scholarship is open to you. Again, you can scan the QR code, look at some of the flyers out in the lobby if you want to learn more information both about the scholarship as well as the legacy of Gloria Brown. Also, the Asian American Student Union and the Pacer AAPI Club are hosting their Howley celebration this Saturday. So that's at Lake Oswego High School from 2 to 4 on the administration field. So again, support the students. And we have our upcoming community meeting. So next month we'll be having Emily Prado, author of Funeral for Flocka. We'll be doing a talk as well as a book giveaway. And then we have in May, Melissa Lowry will be coming and presenting the documentary. It's actually I believe it's the 10th anniversary of Black Girl in Suburbia. So it's a great opportunity, especially for students and families. So I encourage you to mark your calendars for that. Lake Oswego, or Respond to Racism LO is also part of the Clackamas County Equity Coalition, and our upcoming quarterly meeting is going to be on April 18th, so save the date. Special guests will be from the Oregon Department of Justice, discussing the bias hotline and how to use it. It's a lot of questions, as well as they have a toolkit for interactions with law enforcement that they'll also be sharing. So should be an interesting discussion. Again, you can scan the QR code, follow the site. I'm also happy to direct people to this afterwards. And just a few internal plugs. First off, if you've missed any of our community meetings, we live stream them and keep them recorded on Respond to Racism LO, so youtube.com/@RespondToRacismLO. Do follow, subscribe so you don't miss any of our content. We also have series like Life After the Bubble, which you can see here, which is where we interview students of color from classes 2006 through classes of 2021 about their experiences, about some of the groups they were a part of. And it's just an important part of maintaining that history, especially for the students coming after them. So highly encourage you to check that out as well. As always, we encourage you to donate. It's important to bring speakers, programs like this, and keep the work going. And if you're looking to donate to things specifically like the Gloria Brown Scholarship, so we can offer, last year we offered 2, this year we were able to offer 4. If we want to keep boosting that up, it's a good way to, again, support students of color in LO schools. And if you want to make sure you're staying up to date on everything RtR, please sign up for our email. You just go to respondtoracism.org, and there'll be a place to enter your name. Your email is very simple, and then you're on the list, and you can make sure you're up to date on all that is new with Respond to Racism. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers this evening. First, Taylor Stewart is the founder and executive director of the Oregon Remembrance Project. He is a lifelong Portlander and graduated from the University of Portland in 2018 with a degree in communication and a master's in social work from Portland State University in 2021. Taylor started the ORP in 2018 to help communities unearth stories of injustice and engage in the necessary truth-telling and repair required to reconcile instances of historical harm. His work connects historical racism to its present-day legacies in order to inspire contemporary racial justice action. And what started as simply a way to memorialize a man named Alonzo Tucker the most widely documented African-American victim of lynching in Oregon, Taylor has grown to see the power of reconciliation to rectify further instances of historical injustice. He gave a TED Talk with TEDx Portland in 2022 titled, "How Do You Reconcile a Lynching?" which applies to the 3 R's of reconciliation: remembrance, repair, and redemption, to the lynching of Alonzo Tucker. His work now extends to the cover other stories of historical injustice in Oregon. Then I'd like to also introduce Sarah Sanderson. Sarah L. Sanderson's first book is The Place We Make, Breaking the Legacy of Legalized Hate. She holds a Master's of Fine Art in Creative Nonfiction from Seattle Pacific University, a Master's in Teaching from Seattle University, and a Bachelor of English in Philosophy from Wheaton College. She was born in Oregon and returned there 8 years ago after living in various places. Sarah now lives with her family south of Portland near Oregon City, and her pursuits include writing, speaking, teaching creative writing, learning to pray, and building the beloved community. Her writing has appeared in PBS NewsHour and Christianity Today. Visit her at sarahlsanderson.com and instagram.com/SarahLSandersonWriter. So with that, would you please welcome Sarah and Taylor? Those mics will work this way.
Can you guys hear us okay with these microphones? Okay. I'm going to put this in slideshow mode. No, not share it. Sorry. There we go. Thanks for being here. It's good to be here. My being with you has been a long time in the making. I actually met Jocelyn Rice, who's the former executive director, I don't know what her title was, but I met her in the green room of Channel 2 on book launch day. I was going to be on AM Northwest, and she was also on AM Northwest, and we connected, and she said, "Oh, I'll have to get you out to respond to racism," and then she stepped away, and she connected me with Bruce, and so it feels like this has been a long time coming, so I'm glad to finally be here with you. I'm going to do some talking. We'll break for discussion groups. I might do a little more talking, and then Taylor's going to do some talking. So he gets to sit here and look beautiful while I talk for a little while, but feel free to interrupt me anytime. Okay, so as Bruce said, I was born here, I moved away, and then moved back. And when I moved back, one of the first things that I noticed was what this Atlantic headline calls out, that Portland is often considered the whitest city in America. And after having lived in places like New Jersey and Minnesota and Chicago, I noticed that when I moved here. But what I didn't know was the other part of this headline, the racist history of Portland. And I learned about that when I was talking to my brother one day, and I just shared my observation with him. Like, it's sort of weird, Oregon, there's so many white people here. And he said, "Didn't you know that Oregon had this history of anti-black exclusion laws?" And I didn't, I had no idea. So then I decided to go and do some more digging and find out more about that racist history. But of course, for many people, knowing about the racist history is not an invitation to find out more. A lot of people kind of want to hold it at arm's length, right? Or sweep it under the rug, pretend it didn't happen, pretend it isn't affecting us anymore. So I brought you a couple of quotes about reasons why to look at the past from some great writers. One reason is to better understand the present. Jessamine Ward says, "How inextricably woven the past is in the present, how heavily that past bears on the future. We cannot talk about Black Lives Mattering or police brutality without reckoning with the very foundation of this country." So the idea that we can't understand our present without looking at the past. And then the other reason, as James Baldwin puts it, is to be released into a new future. Baldwin says they, and he's speaking about white people, they are still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. So this idea of looking at the past in order to understand the present so that we can be released into a different kind of future. So that was my goal, and I started looking, not knowing that I was going to be writing a book. I just started doing some research into the past. What is the history of our state? And one of the places I ended up zeroing in on was Oregon City. I actually didn't really realize or remember at the time that I started looking at Oregon City that I actually had ancestors who had lived in Oregon City. I kind of made that connection later on, and that helped me kind of get sucked more into the research. But I really started with Oregon City just because it was where I was living. I mean, I live slightly outside Oregon City, but pretty close to Oregon City. Of course, it's our earliest iteration of kind of white society in Oregon, right? Like, of course, there were Native Americans living here, and then there were some traders and sailors and different people who were around. But Oregon City, of course, was the first incorporated city west of the Rocky Mountains. So it was kind of an important early place. And if you look at this picture, you can see a couple of things right off the bat about Oregon City. If you look at the flags on the two ships, you can see that Oregon City was an American place. An American identity was important to the Oregon City settlers. And you can see the church steeple up near the kind of cleft in the cliffs. That was the first Protestant church west of the Rocky Mountains. So you can see that it's an American place, it's a Christian place. What you can't see is that these settlers who built these houses intended it to be a white-only place. There were 3 different anti-black exclusion laws. The one that came into being with the state of Oregon that was voted on when we became a state went like this. No free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall ever come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contract, or maintain any suit therein, and the Legislative Assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such free Negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state, or employ or harbor them therein. And one of the most powerful words, I think, in that whole law is one of the shortest, the word be. They didn't want black people to even be in this state. And these laws were on the books from 1844 until 1926. And so this is the history that I saw when I moved here in 2015 and looked around at who was on the streets, right? The history is still with us. Even though only one person was ever recorded as actually being legally exiled from Oregon because of this law. And so when I found that out, I wanted to get to know more about his story, and that led me to him. This man, his name was Jacob Vanderpool. And this is, we don't have any pictures of him, we don't have any diaries or other artifacts. This is kind of the only thing we have of his words, is an ad that he ran in the Oregon City newspaper every week during the summer of 1851. Oregon Saloon and Boarding House, Main Street opposite the Statesman office, meals furnished at the regular hours for 75 cents. Persons from the country are invited to call. So you can see just from these few words that we have that Jacob Vanderpool was about the business of welcoming people to Oregon. He wanted people to come and rest and be nourished in his establishment, but the problem was that his neighbors in Oregon City didn't want to welcome him. So he was he was arrested, he was tried, he was convicted of breaking that law, and he was forced to leave the state. One of the people who was involved in the case was Theophilus Magruder. Theophilus Magruder ran a boarding house down the street. He had grown up in a slave-owning plantation in Virginia, so he brought those prejudices with him when he came to Oregon. And his saloon boarding house was not getting the best Yelp reviews of 1851. I found one historical person who stayed there who wrote that he moved his things out of there the very next day. Like, he couldn't stand being in this boarding house. So Theophilus Magruder, not doing well at attracting and keeping business, so he looks down the street at the boarding house that Jacob Vanderpool is running, and he decides that the best way to eliminate his competition is to weaponize that exclusion law against his competitor. So I found all this out. I'm researching this man and his life, and then I found out that he is a distant cousin of my own. I didn't even know that when I began researching. And it was when I learned that this became so much more personal for me, and I realized that this wasn't just a story from a long time ago that was interesting. This was my story. It was my family's story. And it was something that I needed to reckon with in order to understand myself and in order to understand what my responsibility is in being a part of this state today. The other person that I spent quite a bit of time researching was Ezra Fisher. He was also a citizen of Oregon City at that time. He was a pastor. He founded the first Baptist church west of the Rocky Mountains in Oregon City. And he was a professor. He founded the first college west of the Rocky Mountains, also in Oregon City. That college obviously doesn't exist anymore. You've never heard of Oregon City College, or maybe you have if you've spent time researching the 1850s, but it became kind of an ancestor of Linfield. So Linfield's, when Oregon City College closed, they donated some things to Linfield. So Ezra Fisher is also a relative of mine. Theophilus Magruder is on my dad's side. Ezra Fisher is on my mom's side. And when I was researching Ezra Fisher, what I found was that he had this position of power and authority in the town, and yet he had stayed silent when Jacob Vanderpool was being exiled. And I was looking, I read his old sermon notes and different things, whatever I could find, and I couldn't find any mention of him, and I'm thinking like, well, did he just say something that I'm not aware of all these years later? And then I found something that his grandson wrote about him, and he wrote that his grandfather's personal policy on matters of race was to stay silent. And so there was that confirmation of his silence. And so looking at these two men, one on my father's side, one on my mother's side, and realizing that these were the twin legacies that I had inherited. On the one hand, this active pushing to make Oregon a white-only state, and on the other hand, this kind of passive, arm's-length silence allowing it to happen. And so that's when this sort of coalesced into a book for me. I felt like it wasn't my story to just go and write about Jacob Vanderpool, this guy who got kicked out of Oregon, until I realized that my family members were involved. And then I realized, no, actually this is my story, because my family was the ones who made this happen. So in the book, I tell the story of Jacob Vanderpool and these men who conspired against him, and then I also wanted to connect the dots between what came before and what I'm holding now. So really to examine what is inside me that has been passed on to me. Not that I wanted it, not that I, even sometimes knew it was there, but things that would just sometimes blip up subconsciously, and I would realize oh, I'm holding a prejudice that was handed to me from the past. So as part of writing this book, I wanted to get really kind of down and dirty into my own psyche and figure out what biases am I holding, and how then can I overturn them? How can I begin to take steps to live into a new kind of future? So the things that I was able to find that were in the past that I also found in my own present were kind of this list of 5 things. Ignorance, like my own willful not knowing for so many years that this was in my family legacy. Greed, the way that the financial decisions that my family had made generations ago had been passed on to me, and then I wanted to hold on to that in some ways, and didn't want to give it back, maybe to the people who it rightfully belonged to. Supremacy, like I said, those like subconscious biases that I spend a lot of time and energy trying to pretend aren't there, but then every once in a while they pop up and I realize this is in here, and maybe I didn't ask for it, maybe I didn't want it, but it's part of the legacy that I've been given. Now I need to do something about it. Silence, really before I wrote this book, I did not spend a lot of time going out and talking about racism. I sort of just bought into it's probably not really my problem, I don't really know what to say. Silence. And then isolation, looking at the ways that my life had sort of created for me this little white bubble. Whether it was my church or my school or my kids' schools or my neighborhood or most of the people in the state of Oregon, I really was living a life that was isolated from people of other races. And so this was the list of 5 things that I identified. Okay, these are things I'm holding now that were handed to me from the past. What do I do to overturn these? And so I talk in the book about trying to move towards these 5 opposites. And not that I have become an expert in all of these things, but this is where I've identified I want to try to go. So the opposite of ignorance, not just being knowledge, but empathy. How can I not only learn about someone else's life, but empathize? Imaginatively insert myself into what it would feel like to be that person, and then where does that lead me? Moving from greed, not just to generosity, because I think that generosity sometimes leaves us in the driver's seat of I will give you a little bit of money, but I'm going to tell you how I think you should spend it, and it's just, the little part that I don't need anymore. But really looking at what I'm holding with open hands and recognizing a lot of this really wasn't ever supposed to be here in the first place. And so that attitude changes the way I hold it and the way I let it go. Moving from supremacy, I find the opposite of that not to be inferiority, but shalom, this ancient Hebrew concept of everything in the right place. What does it look like for all of us to live at peace? Silence, the opposite to that, not just being just blathering on, but really beginning with a place of self-disclosure, being willing to be honest about what I'm finding in my own self, and coming not from a place of expertise, but just willingness to be vulnerable and to be as humble as possible in terms of what I'm finding in myself. And then I think the hardest one was to try to walk into community, because I didn't know how to do it. The other things I could try to figure out on my own, I could try to figure out empathy by reading a book. I could try to figure out having open hands by writing a check. I could, other things I could do on my own. But how did I get to a place of community when I just didn't know who was out there to be in community with? And that's why I'm so glad that Taylor's here. Here we are. It's been really a joy to go around the state of Oregon talking about this book, and then everywhere I go, I'm like, either Taylor's right here with me, or let me tell you about this guy named Taylor and what he's doing. And so it's been fun to kind of make that connection and work together. But those are the 5, so the book is organized around, there are 5 chapters about the historical case, and there are 5 chapters about me and my life, and those are the me and my life memoir type chapters. Again, not that I've arrived in any of those places, but this is the movement that I've tried to be on. So, given all of that, we're going to pause here and ask you to get into, I don't know how you normally do this, like get into small groups or just who's around you. Is that kind of what you normally do? So these are discussion questions for this moment, and we'll have more later on. How do we hold difficult truths? Why have they remained largely hidden? How do they make us feel? What's scary about unpacking our history? And what does our history say about who we are today? So feel free to take any of those and run with it, or if anything I've said kind of makes you want to ping in a different direction, I trust that you can kind of just roll with it. So how do we usually do this, Bruce? Do people just turn to...
Usually get around like maybe 3 or 4 people around you.
Okay.
So I think to relocate.
And how many minutes should we say people? I don't even know what time it is. I don't have a clock.
15, 20 feel good for these questions?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Discuss amongst yourselves. Oh, do you have good for you?
It's like when you come back and have people share out, you just want to have a conversation.
We can.
Yeah. I say if we go for 10 to 15, then have 5 to 10 of share out.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll keep track of time.
They just got mics over there, so I can just run around.
Oh, great. Perfect. Sorry to make you just sit here.
Oh no,
and listen to this
you're
maybe
good.
for a
You're good.
long time.
It's a comfortable seat.
I was thinking when I saw.
Okay, let's bring it back to, do people want to share out just a little bit? Sounds like we're having some good conversations here, but yeah, I'll just be passing the mic around to anyone who would kind of like to share some thoughts from their conversations. Do we have any takers?
No, mine was just a little historical. I came to Oregon, went to the University of Oregon. I did not know anything about Eugene, Oregon. In 66. I did not realize that that was a very racist town. I mean, you had a university. Why would it be racist, right? But they didn't allow black people to live within the city limits. Things kind of got interesting. Landlords had 2 sets of rental schedules. You name it, it went wrong. And that was the beginning of a good education. You knew where to go, where not to go. You knew what jobs you could get, what you couldn't get. So there's been a lot of documentation about Eugene, Oregon, and it's, people are learning. Something went wrong.
Well, our group cut right to the chase. We said, all this is good, but we're talking to the choir. Where do we go from here? How do we get from where we are to where we want to be? We don't have that answer, but we want to pose that to the rest of the group here. Let's find a way to move forward and respond to racism and get to the next step.
Do we have any responses
at the front.
online? Okay.
We got Jeremy in the front here.
Yeah.
I was listening to Bruce talk about kind of unfair practices like General Motors, labor unions, and how economically disadvantaged people of color were in situations like that. And it's really easy to kind of devolve into this conversation of like governments or institutions or banks or redlining. All these institutional things have created a very strong case why reparations need to happen. So we should like lash out against those organizations and those institutions and say, how can we make reparations for the ways that we have white people have benefited from disadvantaging people of color? But then I had a similar experience to what Sarah mentioned in the book in realizing that I have ancestors who owned slaves. And I think that brings it closer to home. I think this book is a really good calling for us to like think about how have our own lives been impacted by this, that some of the things that I've inherited or the economic comfort that my family may have passed on to me is a direct result of stealing people's labor and lives. And I think that's a good place to start and to realize that we're all complicit in that. And it's not just us being activists against those evil banks who instituted redlining, but we are all part of that. We, white people, we are all part of that. We have all benefited from that. And I don't know where to go from here, but I think it's a good conversation to have and to start asking ourselves, what do we do about it? And not as, like Sarah says, charity, but recognize that it's justice, it's shalom to do that.
I agree with moving and seeing what we can do to move these ideas forward, but I also like your emphasis on unpacking and seeing what has brought us to this place as individuals. When we were talking in our group, things came up that I don't know for sure my family history. I know we don't have roots in the South, but we also we were colorblind. And that was something that my family felt was important, that you don't think about people's race but there was prejudice in that, because then you're saying that their racial identity is not important and is not part of who they are. Let's just make everybody white, basically. and then we don't have to deal with those issues. So the unpacking part, I think, is crucial to take those next steps.
I'm an obnoxious human who dissected the first question into a variety of parts and made my group come with me on that journey. The first word of the first question, how? How do we hold difficult truths? We all listed various ways that's an embodied practice. We hold difficult truths individually, maybe in our bodies, as high blood pressure, as digestive disorders, as a variety of immune system responses. We moved on through the question into how do we hold difficult truths? And we talked individually sometimes, like for each of us, but also like collectively. How do we collectively, socially hold difficult truths? How do we obscure them? What stories do we tell about them? What euphemisms do we use? And then kind of the end of that first question is difficult. My first question was difficult for whom? Difficult truths. Who are they difficult for? And that kind of centered us more in the realm of what is difficult in our history and for whom is that difficult to grapple. So yeah, we just talked, that led us into kind of some of the next questions of, complicity and shame and what does that mean, and how the stories we tell sometimes when we're maybe prideful. I'm really appreciating the sequence of these questions, so thank you to whoever designed them. And I just want to invite us into, I know it can feel like, oh, these aren't for us. I already know these things. And I appreciate that because sometimes that is I've grappled with these things before. I've done a lot of study, including at the graduate level, on these very questions. And every time I encounter them, there's something new for me personally, and I just appreciate Sarah's kind of story of like, oh, as I encountered these things, it was me. I did have a stake in this story. This is my story, and so, I'm just reflecting on that and how much I hold in my own body around difficult truths. So thanks.
Thank you all for the thoughtfulness that you brought to those questions, those conversations. Just grateful for your showing up and thinking about these things. We're going to keep going. I have a few more things to share with you, and then I will turn it over to Taylor. I want to share with you just briefly kind of looking again at the past, present, future of Jacob Vanderpool's story in particular. Because I think that it is powerful when communities grapple with their local history. The subject of racism is so huge and there's so much, and if we get too overwhelmed in like hundreds of years and all over the globe, then it can paralyze us. But I think there's real power in looking at, okay, what happened here and how can we address that? And so that's part of the work that Taylor's doing, and I'm just going to share this example of Oregon City's story, and then I'll tell you a little bit about Gladstone's story because I do live in Gladstone. And then we'll open it up for you to think about what might it look like for you to grapple with. I know you already are, but what's Lake Oswego's job then, right? So anyway, in Oregon City, I really wanted to figure out where Jacob Vanderpool had lived and worked because I wanted to go there, to say I was sorry, to maybe I imagined, like, maybe I could convince the person who lives there to put up a plaque or something. So it was really difficult to figure out where he had lived and worked because there wasn't this neat, like, address system, you know, from 1851. But I got some help from the Oregon Black Pioneers, and they helped me figure out that I believe, and I could be wrong, but I think that Jacob Vanderpool, so you see the white church. This is like a different angle from the picture I showed you before. Now we're up on the cliff looking down on the town. So that's the same white church on the left, and then see how, like, across to the right there's a gray building that, I wish I had like a pointer or something, but see that dark gray building kind of up just over from the church? That, I believe, was Jacob Vanderpool's saloon and boarding house. And this picture was painted during the time that he would have been there. So that's kind of cool to think about. An artist actually stood on the hill and looked down and painted Jacob Vanderpool's saloon and boarding house. And I'll also say, while we have this picture up, that you can see that this artist is aware, he's foregrounding the experience of the Native Americans who are being ejected from this place as well by the community development that's happening down below. And that was a story that kept coming up for me and that I kept having to write into this book that I ended up writing because it's so much a part of our story of this place. So that is where Jacob Vanderpool lived and worked in 1851. It looks a little bit like this today, although you'd have to go like 2 more blocks down the road. My son, actually, I have a 17-year-old, and just over the weekend he said to me, "Mom, my friend and I are gonna go and explore those factories down there." And I was like, "Well, you know, technically that's illegal." And he was like, "I know, but we're gonna do it anyway, is that okay?" Like, just don't get caught, I guess. I read an article one time, this is a total aside for those of you who have teenage boys. If you let teenage boys take risks that are like somewhat safe, then it helps them not take the risks that are like really bad. So I was like, well, you know, I guess hopefully, anyway, they went and they survived. And he got a bunch of really cool pictures. So I'll have to grab some of his pictures for this part of the talk. But Mom is staying in the car, like looking, you know, I'm not going in the place where I'm not supposed to go. Anyway, the reason that there is no trespassing in that area right now is that it is actually a piece of land that has been bought back by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. So that is a super cool piece of this story, that the land where Jacob Vanderpool lived and worked, where he was exiled from, has now been bought back by the people who were also exiled from that land, and they're now coming back. And they have a plan for the future, which looks like this. Their plan, and it's gonna take a lot of time, hopefully years from now, they envision that all those factories will be removed and they're gonna have mixed use retail and businesses and apartments, and open up the falls so that people can see Willamette Falls. I didn't realize until I did this research. Did you know that Willamette Falls is the 2nd largest by volume in the country, second only to Niagara Falls? You guys know better than I did. But yeah, I mean, it's huge. Of course it makes sense, right? That we have so much rain falling from the sky that we would have a big waterfall. So I'm super excited about what they're gonna do with it, and I was able to, how I found out that they don't allow you to go in that property was, I was walking with my husband, I was like, I think Jacob Vanderpool is down here, let's go. And he like pushed on the gate, and immediately out comes the security guard. And I'm like, oh, can you get me in touch with the tribe? Because I had been trying, like, sending them emails and leaving voicemails, and they hadn't responded, and she was like, sure, here's the business card. So I was able to make a connection with the tribe, and I was able to be on the Zoom call with Taylor and Zachary Stocks of Oregon Black Pioneers, and just to listen as Taylor and Zachary said, would you be willing to put a memorial to Jacob Vanderpool when you redevelop this property? And we were just picturing a plaque, and they said, we're gonna put up a hotel or or a restaurant, or like we're gonna do something that really memorializes what he was trying to do and name it after him. So it's super exciting. And it'll probably be 20 years away, but you know, hopefully someday they actually will be able to, you know, realize that dream. Meanwhile, my daughter, I don't know if you remember the bird that was in his ad, but my daughter painted it into a mural in her high school hallway. So if you ever happen to be in Gladstone High School, you can go take a look at Jacob Vanderpool's bird. So, every place has a story. And unfortunately, every place has a story of racial injustice. And so the question for all these little communities all over the world, all over the state of Oregon is, what can we do here to help remember the past in a way that helps us to create a different future? One story that I like to tell, I just a couple weeks ago got to be in the city of Waldport. I don't know if you've ever been to Waldport or know their story of what the work they've done with Lewis Southworth, but you know, really small town, 2,000 people. And they got together and they said, there is a street in our town that is named a racial slur. We don't want that anymore. And they uncovered the history of who had been there, why the street had that name. And they changed the name of the street, and they commissioned a beautiful statue in his honor, and they're creating a park. So that's like the kind of thing that only they could do, right? Only those 2,000 people who live in that little tiny town could investigate their own story and turn it into something beautiful. In Gladstone, where I live, we're looking at, oh, this is, I forgot this was in here. I'm not gonna belabor this, but if you're looking for what the past is of your community, these are some ideas of places to look. I'm gonna move on, but if you don't have time to read this and you want to ask me more, ask me later. This is part of our history in Gladstone. This was a 1922 newspaper that talks about how on the Seventh-day Adventist property, which was not owned by the Seventh-day Adventists at the time, it was the Chautauqua grounds. I don't know if you've ever been off the Gladstone DMV exit off 205, but right there's a parcel of land that was used as a festival and fairgrounds. And in 1922, they had a big KKK initiation ceremony. And the article goes on to say that 2,000 people came out to watch. And this is part of our history in Gladstone. And so we're just beginning the process of, okay, this is our history, what do we do now? We're actually gonna meet on Thursday with Taylor, and we're gonna just start to talk more about like, where do we go from here? And the reason it's important to dig those stories out is because if we don't address them, they don't just go away, right? This happened in 1922. In 1980, this picture was put in the Gladstone High School yearbook. And the caption reads, "There were several double takes and a gasp or two when the group of 20 Ku Klux Klansmen appeared on costume day." So 20 kids showed up dressed like this and weren't sent home to change. They weren't suspended. They had their picture taken and put in the yearbook. And that was 1980. And then just last week, a friend of my son's had some racial epithets said at him in the halls of Gladstone High School. So these things are still with us, right? Unless we take the time to look at, okay, what is our history? And are we willing to be honest about that? And then how do we move forward and remember it in a different way? So that's the work that we're beginning to do in Gladstone. Every story has more to write, and Taylor's going to talk more about that. But before I turn it over to Taylor, I do want to show you, Bruce mentioned the Clackamas County Equity Coalition. Just, you're already on here. Respond to Racism is on here, but just so you know that all of these other groups, and you probably already do know, all those other groups are coming together to try to address some of these things, including Taylor's baby, Oregon Remembrance Project, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Stewart and I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Remembrance Project. I help communities with truth and reconciliation projects around repairing historical injustice. We connect historical racism to its present-day legacies in order to inspire contemporary racial justice action. And when I was growing up, never in a million years would I have thought this is how I would be spending my life. But my life changed when I took a civil rights trip to the American South in 2018. We went to Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. I had especially been looking forward to the portion of the trip where we'd be going to Montgomery because we had plans to see the new Equal Justice Initiative museums. In April 2018, the Equal Justice Initiative opened up 2 museums. The first was the Legacy Museum, which chronicled the link between slavery and mass incarceration with the belief that slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. The second museum was the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, a memorial to the thousands of African American lynching victims in the United States. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented nearly 6,500 lynchings of African Americans between the years of 1865 to 1950. When you enter the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, you're met with these 6-foot-high pillars that have the name of the state, the name of the county, and then the names of everyone who was lynched in that county. I'd always known about lynching in the abstract, but to actually read the names of people who were lynched in this country made this history personal. Most specifically, what personalized this history for me the most was seeing names with the last name Stewart, knowing that simply time and place separated me from the name on that pillar. I'd lived in Oregon my entire life, and I couldn't believe that I had to go all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, just to learn that there had been at least one widely documented lynching of an African American here in Oregon. In addition to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Equal Justice Initiative also started the Community Remembrance Project, which aims to work in the communities where the lynchings of African Americans took place to find healing and reconciliation through a sober reflection on history. There is an interest forum online about getting involved with the Community Remembrance Project, and I would love to say that when I first saw that, I was immediately like, sign me up, how can I help? But in reality, I was too nervous to fill out the interest form. I was a recent college grad with 0 relevant experience, and I ultimately figured to myself, who am I to really think that I could be of any help? So I decided that I wasn't going to fill out the interest form. But thankfully, 2 encounters from the rest of my trip inspired me to change my mind. The first was a quote from John Lewis, longtime civil rights icon and congressman from Georgia, who asked, "If not us, then who? If not now, then when?" I don't remember where I was when I first read that quote, but I remember getting that feeling inside of myself where I was like, are you talking to me? Like, I'll think about it, John. And the second encounter was the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. There, they didn't just focus on the Martin Luther Kings, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X's of the world. Instead, the museum told the story of everyday Mississippians who did their part to pave the way for justice. And so, there at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum is where I learned that you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. And so, those 2 encounters gave me the courage to reach out to the Equal Justice Initiative, and I proceeded to work with the community of Coos Bay, Oregon for 3 years to memorialize a man named Alonzo Tucker, Oregon's most widely documented African-American victim of lynching. February 2020, we held a soil collection ceremony near the spot of the lynching and collected soil that would go into 2 jars. One that was turned into an exhibit in the community and the other that was sent back to the Equal Justice Initiative. Within this soil was soil collected from 3 different locations, with each bit of soil representing part of Alonzo Tucker's story. The first bit was gathered from underneath the local docks, where Alonzo Tucker spent the night hiding from a mob who had formed to lynch him after he had been accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. The second bit of soil was gathered from Front Street, where Alonzo Tucker was repeatedly shot and left incapacitated before a noose was placed around his neck and he was thrown in the back of a cart with the intention of lynching him from the spot of the alleged assault. The third bit of soil was gathered from where the old Marshfield Bridge used to be, which is where the mob strung up Alonzo Tucker's dead body in front of a crowd of 300. Even children were part of the lynch mob that left Alonzo Tucker's body hanging there for several hours. Despite this all occurring in broad daylight without a masked man in the crowd, no one would ever be held accountable for the lynching of Alonzo Tucker. In the 1970s, the local newspaper, one of the reporters interviewed 3 white men who were boys at the time of the 1902 lynching, and they provided eyewitness accounts. All 3 men believed Alonzo Tucker was lynched over a consensual relationship with the woman who accused him of assault. Community members were able to physically hold this story in their hands as they transferred the soil into 2 jars. This was a meaningful first step in this process of reconciliation for the community of Coos Bay. We continued these acts of remembrance via a historical marker that we installed in June 2021 outside of the History Museum to memorialize both Alonzo Tucker and the thousands of other African Americans who were lynched in this country. There were 300 people at the 1902 lynching, but we had over 600 people gathered in 2021 in person and virtually to add a new chapter to Alonzo Tucker's story at the historical marker unveiling. I say that there are 2 dates of significance on the Alonzo Tucker historical marker: 1902, when the lynching occurred, and 2021, when the historical marker was unveiled, and that we can't fully understand the story of Alonzo Tucker only focusing on the 1902 date, as his story now continues on into 2020 and 2021, when that same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to the ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. We held the historical marker unveiling as part of Coos Bay's first ever Juneteenth celebration in 2021. An exciting aspect of this project has been the ways that the community has continued the celebration of Juneteenth ever since. In 2022, the community unveiled another historical marker in the community about a diverse mining community known as Beaver Hill, which was about one of the most diverse pockets of Oregon at the end of the 1800s, and allowed African Americans from their community and the surrounding area to showcase their history, tradition, and culture, all a part of this renewed effort to tell more diverse stories in their local history. This past year in 2023, there were 3 events as part of Juneteenth in Coos Bay. I gave a talk at the History Museum on Saturday morning. We had a family-style gathering on Saturday evening, and then on the Monday of Juneteenth, we showed a film. And I'd say we had about 150 unique participants across all 3 events, which may not sound like much, but Coos Bay is only 15,000, so we had about 1% of the city population participating in Juneteenth, which would be the Portland equivalent of nearly 6,400 individuals. So I say that Coos Bay has the largest Juneteenth event per capita in the state of Oregon. And so to see the way that this work made not only an impact in my life, but the lives of those who I worked with in the community of Coos Bay, it inspired me to want to continue helping other communities with truth and reconciliation projects. And so what started as this relatively obscure personal side project has grown into how I hope to spend the rest of my life. Most notably, for the last 3 years, I have been working with the community of Grants Pass, Oregon, to reconcile their history of being a sundown town. Like Eugene, sundown towns were communities that purposefully excluded African Americans and other racial minorities from living in or simply passing through the community through a culture of fear, violence, and intimidation. Like dozens, if not hundreds, of communities across the United States, there was a sign in Grants Pass into the late 1960s, early 1970s that said, "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you here." And so, the title of our work is called The Sunrise Project, with the idea that sunrise is the opposite to sundown and signals the start of a new day. So we're trying to develop this new identity in Grants Pass is that of a sunrise community, essentially the opposite to a sundown town. A place with which everyone can feel safe, respected, and like they can call this space their home. And so through the Sunrise Project, we are looking to feed the needs of the spirit of being, belonging, and becoming for African Americans in a formerly exclusionary community. Through direct community engagement via events, oral history collection, creation of educational resources, and community conversations, we are trying to create experiences for people that help teach them this process of reconciliation that can hopefully lead to a more welcoming community. We're trying to create inclusivity to become a core part of what it means to be a resident in the community of Grants Pass. In addition to our direct work with the community, we are working towards the installation of a historical marker, discussing Oregon and Grants Pass's history of racial exclusion, but also functioning as the community's stated commitment to inclusivity, or Sunrise Commitment, a commitment to how we want to treat one another. What's exciting is that if we're successful, this will become the United States' first ever historical marker about sundown towns. And the goal is to expand the Sunrise Project across Oregon and create a blueprint for communities across the country. We launched the Sunrise Project in Ashland back in February, and there's a group in Eastern Oregon who are looking to bring this work to their communities as well. And so I'm excited that we can actually create things in our communities because of our histories of racial injustice. Working with Sarah and others in the Oregon City community to physically memorialize Jacob Vanderpool, where his business once stood, but then notably, not just taking the physical memorialization, but then what can we do in our communities to actually repair that history of racial exclusion? And so my hope is to help the city of Oregon City develop recruitment and retention plans for people of color in Oregon City as our way of honoring the experience of Jacob Vanderpool. Because while our state may no longer have legal expulsions, our cultural climate still foments an element of social expulsion on our communities of color. I was talking to a gentleman who lives in Oregon City, and he said that when he first moved there, he was an African-American gentleman, he said that he just shaved his head because he couldn't find anywhere to get a haircut. And we need to have more spaces in our communities that allow for people of color to be able to simply be, belong, and become. And so I'm excited about what we can do in Oregon City in addition to the work that's happening with the Grand Ronde Tribe. And then, as we're gonna have a meeting this Thursday about, all right, what do we do with this history of the Ku Klux Klan? And so I think that we're gonna focus on the Ku Klux Klan's definition of 100% American, meaning straight white Christian Protestants. And so what does it mean to decentralize whiteness from American identity? As we have this conversation about who gets to be American, what rights are afforded to Americans, and what obstacles stand in the way between life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so getting this conversation going in Gladstone, our hope is to generate really vibrant cultural holiday months, so that in a place that used to have the history of the Ku Klux Klan, they have a vibrant Black History Month, they have a vibrant Asian Pacific Islander Month, they have a vibrant Hispanic Heritage Month, Native American History Month, that these individuals who are part of our history, who are American and represent the diversity of what it means to be American, is our way of pushing back on that centralization of whiteness as American. And so I'm excited about what we're doing in Oregon that really started in this community of Coos Bay, where if community members in Coos Bay can come together to deal with something as painful as a lynching, I think that there are communities across our state who should rely on that as a place of inspiration so that we can face our own histories within our communities. And so one of the things that we'll be talking about next is Lake Oswego was a sundown town. I don't know how long ago I heard it, but it's been years. Lake No Negro was a phrase that you grew up with. And so Lake Oswego and other similar communities are what we would refer to as sundown suburbs, where some of the institutionalization of redlining that helped create these communities is a little bit different than the experience of sundown towns in your more rural spaces. Sundown towns weren't necessarily places with which white people went into and then said, no African Americans. More often or not, they were interracial spaces that, quote, went sundown when the white population violently expelled its African American population. And so African Americans were actually more widely dispersed across the United States in 1890 than they were in 1930, when African Americans were systemically dispersed from rural spaces into condensed urban settings. And so even within those urban settings, there then became, well, how do we restrict African American mobility within the urban core? And so redlining and the creation of sundown suburbs helped preserve whiteness still near the urban cores of our communities. And so something that we'll be talking about is colloquially known as Lake No Negro. Lake Oswego is what we consider a sundown suburb. Redlining, economic interest, and white flight spurred the creation of all-white pockets outside of the urban core. This exclusion was maintained via social and systemic mechanisms that prevented most African Americans from accessing suburban expansion during the 20th century. And so our questions are, how did racial exclusion manifest itself in Lake Oswego, and what are the contemporary ramifications of this history? What were the economic impacts on African Americans being unable to generate wealth in the Lake Oswego community? And finally, what would look different if Lake Oswego became known as a sunrise community? So talk amongst yourselves for a little bit while, and we'll bring it back, have some group discussion, and answer any final questions between Sarah and I.
Okay. No worries. So yeah, hopefully people got ample amount of time to engage with the discussion or with the questions on the screen. So again, I'd like to pass the mic around for people to share what came out of their discussions. Do you have any brave takers?
Hi there. I'm Catherine McMullen. I'm your elected county clerk, and we had a recent. Hello? Okay. We had a recent small win in terms of looking at our history of racial exclusion in Lake Oswego and in Oregon in general. We worked with homeowners, a couple, to redact the racist language that was in their property deed legally and completely. Working with the court system, with the homeowners. It was a law that went into effect January 1st. The Department of Justice doesn't have to put a practice into place to actually work through it, though, until January 1st of next year. But we were able to successfully do it. And I just had a small part. I supervise our recording division, which is where we hold all property records from the beginning of when white people came here and took property. Every single time it exchanged hands, that is recorded in the recording division at the county office. And any exclusion, any discriminatory language is also included. And so being able to work with the court system, get a court order, have the racist language redacted, and then re-record that deed with the language redacted so that it doesn't show up in the full history of this property. And so it's possible to do that. We were talking about how hard it still is. I was feeling a little defensive when we were talking about it because it was so hard to do it the first time and I was just a small part of it. But I don't know what else to say except that I think that having a way to do that easily, or at least a way that is like follow this recipe to look at your own property, figure this out, would be a way to contribute.
Bruce, there's a few online comments.
Okay.
One is, if LO were a sunrise town, all our children would have a rich and safe learning environment. Differences would not be feared, but rather they would be embraced. Another one is, suburban homes often have deeds on that they say the house cannot be resold to Black, Indigenous, people of color. Perhaps we could work to revise with donated real estate attorneys to revise deeds.
Yeah, similar to my experience going to Montgomery and seeing the evolution of slavery in the United States, I am very much interested in the evolution of Oregon's Black exclusionary laws, from foundation to sundown towns, to restrictive covenants, to redlining, gentrification, and the displacement that we still have today. And that, one thing about reconciliation, I believe reconciliation requires specificity, and that we can get specific in the ways that we can counter our state's history of racial exclusion. My overarching hope for the rest of my life is to rewrite the ending to the story of the state founded with racially exclusionary laws. My bold goal is to raise the African American population from 2 to 5% by the year 2050. That may sound a little bit crazy. You're like, that's not that long for now. But the racial demographics of the United States are shifting rapidly. And it's expected that in the year 2044, people of color will make up greater than 50% of the US population. But the United States will not, quote, brown evenly. And I think that there will be a second generation of white flight, where in the same ways that whites left the cities to move to the suburbs, whites will leave the more demographically changing states and move to the Northwest and the Northeast. And so, Oregon founded in 1859. I don't want 200 years to go by And Oregon is once again the white utopia where people move specifically for its whiteness. And so what do we do over these next 30 years to not make Oregon once again the white utopia? And I think that it starts on a community level. I want to, to be able to remove the restrictive covenants, but also document where they took place so we can have a wider understanding. And since this process is so difficult, I would love to be able to create, groups of people who, it's not just, all right, hey, here's a process that you go then do by yourself, and it's kind of really hard to figure out. But like, hey, there's a group of people who will help walk you through how to do all these things, and you have support. And for that to be endemic in the Lake Oswego community, I think is one way of getting towards that idea of a sunrise community. How cool would that be in 20, 30 years to be like, there is no deeds with restrictive covenants in the Lake Oswego community. We've, of course, have documented where they used to be, but to have an entirely, deeds in the city without restrictive covenants. And so I think this work starts in groups like this. It involves getting people together to try and do something regarding this history. And one thing that I tell people is, don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing one thing. And so it's really all about finding that one thing you can do. And if getting involved in removing restrictive covenants is something that interests you, I think that we could create some sort of collective strength around that, movement around that.
Our representative, Daniel Wynn, sponsored legislation. Daniel and I had a conversation about this, and I reminded him that the deeds were messed up. Now, we know that you can't go and pull all the books out and scratch it all out, but you can make it illegal to use the covenant. In other words, you cannot refer to it. It's not part of the sale. It's done. Now, piece by piece, as papers get reissued, then maybe it'll be cleaner copies. Because it's going to be a massive task. Face facts. And a lot of people here didn't even know that that was in their paperwork.
I currently am on the Historic Resources Advisory Board, and one of the things that the questions raised for us is the economic issue of there being a bigger BIPOC community in this community. But the idea that we have that vestige left in our deeds suggests to me that maybe we don't wait for the state to do it, we ask the city council to do it. The city council seems to be very interested in improving the Lake No Negro view, and that would be a huge step if they were to simply make it such that there is no deed in the city that can have that kind of a racially exclusionary provision.
It's a little bit worse yet. It's the entire state of Oregon.
Oh, indeed, but we start here.
We could move into a question and answer time. If anybody has any other questions or general comments.
I'd actually like to share something about
Yeah.
the economics, because I think, especially with Black community I've talked to throughout the years in Lake Oswego, there's a very transactional relationship with the town, knowing the history. So, the people move for the schools. I was sharing a story with you all about just the status of Black athletes in the schools, where on one hand you're on this pedestal, but also even then that is tenuous. So if you bear with me, I do want to share the story I was kind of sharing with you of a student, Marquise Royster, who unfortunately unexpectedly passed last summer. And I went to his celebration of life. And it was interesting because if he had gone to his neighborhood school, he would have gone to, at the time, Wilson, now Ida B. Wells. But LO schools, reputation, especially around like football, is big. So he got in the LO schools program, and then it made the news in around 2013, I want to say, 2012, 2013, when his teammates called him the N-word on Twitter. And he transferred to Lakeridge and made the news again because he was physically assaulted by an assistant coach. Eventually they settled with the district, but that's a lot of it's a lot of stress. There's a lot of things to deal with. Fast forward to, again, just you never want to be at a young person's funeral. But they had about a 90-minute just sharing of stories, and throughout that entire time, what people talked about were what he experienced in Lake Oswego and the role he played as a protector for his peers, for his younger siblings, for fellow teammates. Because unfortunately, when you don't have adults, well, I shouldn't say not all adults, you have family, but when you don't have the teachers, staff, any of that support, you take it on yourself. And it was just, it sticks with you when people just talk about the weight you deal with. And that's these things that people here deal with, whether it be in sports, whether it be people professionally who come in and cycle out every 2 to 3 years, which we don't talk about. We talk about the first hire, the first elected official, but then fast forward again, 2-3 years. How many people stay? For those who are able to stay, what is the price of staying? When do we wrestle with these questions? So it's not a question, but a comment. I feel remiss if I didn't share that story, especially in the context of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So I've lived in Portland my whole life, technically unincorporated Washington County. And I live in North Portland with my wife, who's in the back. Everyone look at wave. Growing up here, I figure if I can't change the whole world, can't change the whole country, I want to change where I'm from. And whenever I meet an African American who moves to the Portland area, I always ask them, how do you like it? And 10 out of 10, 100% of the time, they always say some iteration of, it's an adjustment. And that is not said positively. It is, for most people, I've never been around such a high concentration of whiteness. That's not necessarily just white people, but whiteness. And so this is, Bruce is also from here. We choose to stay, and we want to change the reputation for Oregon. Change the experiences people have. I do work in the death penalty in Oregon. I help lead that effort. My TED Talk is about our need to end the death penalty in Oregon as the next step of lynching reconciliation. And I meet people, so I meet organizers of color from across the country, and I am always surprised at their feelings about Oregon. I remember I was like telling someone from Nevada, I was like, oh, come out to Portland, come out to Oregon, and he said, no, I don't want to get hate crimed. And you're like, whew, you're not off base for having that reaction, but it's still to have someone vocalize that. Talking to people from South Carolina, and they're like, yeah, I don't want to go out to Oregon. It's so racist out there. And I was like, y'all were in the Confederacy. It's interesting. I meet African Americans from across the country, and it's kind of like, we're used to our white people. Your white people are different. It's a little bit more evident who to stay away from, whereas out here, it hits differently to be racially subjugated by the same people who have Black Lives Matter signs in their front yard. And so there is a climate that we have to deal with Oregon and the larger Portland metropolitan area. We like to say we care about all these things, but how do we actually change the experience of people who come into our space, I think, is sort of the imperative. And you don't have to change the entire experience of Oregon, but how can we start locally? How can we change the experience of someone in a Lake Oswego neighborhood, at their Lake Oswego church, at their community center? How can we start small and start changing the experiences that people have in our communities?
I mean, being one of those people you're just talking about, I really don't really. What would be your vision of? Well, let me tell a quick story. There was a woman that came to my company, which was FLIR Systems. It's one of the bigger companies in the area, and she was from Chicago. She was black, and she was very outgoing. Just a real nice woman. And she was in our Toastmasters group, so I got to know her. She would give talks, and I'd give talks. And at one point, she said, "Well, I'm moving to Washington, D.C." I said, "Well, okay, that's nice." She says, "I've been here for a year and a half, and I have not made a single friend that would take me to dinner or have me over." And she says, everybody's really nice here at work, but she says there just doesn't seem to be a way for me to integrate. I'm not sure what the term is, but what would be, does somebody have any idea of what the vision would be to make it different? How would it be different? Mm-hmm. What would it look like?
In sort of the Clackamas County area, it's also in a lot in Southern Oregon, where people have to leave their home community to find their cultural community. And so, a lot of people who don't live in Portland proper have to come to Portland proper to experience black barbershops, food that reminds them of home, people that look like them. Where do you go for their Juneteenth celebration? They'll probably go to the larger metropolitan area. And so my hope is to make more spaces within communities to have contained experiences of culture. Places, so I went to Atlanta for the first time a number of years ago. And one thing that I remember is liking the music everywhere I went, and that was a really new experience, where you just walk into a restaurant, your hotel, and you're like, yo, it hits. And I was in my Hilton hotel, and they were playing Drake, and I was like, this is cool. And how can we recreate those experiences here at home? So I got my master's from Portland State, and before it was virtual for COVID, I was on campus for a little bit, and I would frequently go to, there's a Pizzicato that used to be down there on the campus. And out of all the places where I could go to get food and just kill time between classes, I would like to go to that Pizzicato because they played a lot of R&B. I don't know who ran the playlists there, but just going into that space made me more comfortable. And I'm not saying we've got to change the playlists of every coffee shop and restaurant in the community, but how can we create more spaces where people can go and feel like this is my space too? And so I hope to, I'm talking to some people at the Port of Portland. How can we, so the PDX is most people's first encounter with the city of Portland. How do we preview what they want? We want their experience to be. If you go downstairs to the baggage claim, there's 1.5 million brochures about all the nature things you can do in Portland and Oregon. There is no brochure about here are the black-owned businesses in and around the city. Here's a list of some of the, are you in town during one of our cultural holiday celebrations? I would like to be able to create more easily accessible databases of ways to get involved and to be of your community of color. How do you find a person of color therapist? How do you find a barbershop, food? To be able to create more of those things that are easily accessible. If you just Google Black Therapist Portland, it just basically just brings up this website called Psychology Today, which is like the most used sort of nature. But it doesn't actually categorize by race. Like you can input it that is what you want, but it'll filter mostly white individuals despite your search. And so if there's so few Black mental health practitioners in the Portland area, and people just don't know how to find them. And people are out there, but they don't know how to access them. They don't know where to find the groups. There's a group in Portland called Say Hey, which is for people of color professionals who have either just moved to or are just looking to connect with other professionals of color. There's a lot of things out there that people just don't know about. I would like to create sort of a modern day green book of these places out and about in cities so that people can feel connected to them. That's what I would like to do on a wider level, but on a how do people in this room get about doing that? Well, join me in doing this work in your community. You can help support the Oregon Remembrance Project via one of 3 T's: your time, your talent, or your treasure. Emphasis on the last one. You can reach out to me via the Oregon Remembrance Project website, and I would love to be in conversation with you about what it would look like to bring the Sunrise Project to the community of Lake Oswego. You don't have to be an extraordinary person to do this work. One thing that I love to tell people is that I wish it was my idea to use the word sunrise for the Sunrise Project. But that idea came from a 69-year-old white male truck driver from Grants Pass named Randolph. And so that is really what this is about. It's about ordinary people finding their collective power to do extraordinary things. And so if this is the kind of work that speaks to you, I hope that you will reach out to me or talk to me at the end of this. And this is how it starts. It starts small. The work in Grants Pass started because a homeschool mom connected with me and was like, hey, we want to do this. And we've been able to grow the work. And so it just takes taking the first step. Faith is taking the first step even when you can't see the full staircase. And so I hope that you will join me. It doesn't have to be now. You can think about it. When I saw that interest form in the South, I wasn't ready. I was like, why me? But I hope that you will take away that this work is truly done by ordinary people, and that you have the power to create a sunrise community in Lake Oswego.
I want to just add on to that great question, like how do we do this? The other piece of it is, how do white people feel about hearing R&B or seeing more Black faces? Is there even a subconscious level of, this might be more dangerous because of these messages that have been said in this country for hundreds of years, that this skin type equals danger, right? And so how do we unhook that in ourselves? And then how do we help our white friends and neighbors to unhook that? There's hundreds of years of psychology behind that, and there's anxiety that goes up. And so how can we start talking about this and start to ground our bodies as white people in like, actually, this is like, we don't have to be anxious about this, and we can help each other not be anxious about this.
Sorry. Thank you for that, Sarah. A question. Can you hear me? Okay. One question that I have, and mainly it's because I have children they have white father. So I guess when we're sitting in a group like this, the first thing that I'd like to know is define white. Like, we are sitting in a room full of people that find this a fascinating subject, and that, you know, we want to move forward. But at the end of the day, where are the Black people of our community? How did we reach out to them? Taylor, you know, what mechanisms are we using to get them engaged, and what's that conversation? Because while this is a really important conversation, and you're speaking on behalf of, you know, what you've uncovered from your ancestors and things like that, where are the people that were actually affected, and like, how are they being represented other than by Bruce and his family? I just first like to know that. And then secondly, Taylor, to you, how do you answer people, and I'm just saying this because I was raised white, how do you answer to people that might say to you, you come into a congregation with, you know, wanting to fix things, and you know, we've uncovered and we have some things, but how do you explain that if your partner for life is American and white? Like, and then how are you acting on behalf of the African American people or the Black community without having some hint of, you know, having too much white? And the reason I say this is because when Black Lives Mattered, and that was the thing that was happening, my children went down to learn how to peacefully protest, to learn this, and they came home really upset because they weren't Black enough. Because we are, you know, I'm Polynesian, I'm born in Tonga, and we are other or Asian Pacific Islander, but they wanted to go and participate and do and be, but at the end of the day, they were like, Mom, you know, we need some education around this. So while we are holding our community members responsible for the, you know, I guess, sins of our fathers, at the end of the day, where is the community that wants this change, and how are we reaching out to them to hear their voices and to make sure that we're all unified and not just speaking on behalf of what we feel was an injustice done to us because of our ancestors?
In each of the communities that I work with, so it is largely, you know, participated in via white individuals, because it's in Southern Oregon. But in each coalition, we have what we've established as, quote, an advisory council. And so a group of African Americans who may not have either the time, the bandwidth, or the comfortability taking a front-facing role in the community, or in this project, for, you know, they're like, I'm just trying to keep my head down and get through life. And so we use our core coalition of majority white people who act on behalf of the desires of the advisory council. And in terms so one of the things is like, all right, we're in this space largely preaching to the choir. How do you expand the people you interact with? Sort of state/city sponsored events are a great entry point for the kind of people who probably aren't going to come to respond to racism event, but may be in town walking when the town's Juneteenth event is happening and may come in via that way. Cultural holidays and like state-sponsored events are one of the easier points of entry for people to come into this work. And so that's why we do a lot of, we in all the communities we try to create these vibrant Martin Luther King days, these vibrant Juneteenths, where someone who may not want to show up on a Monday evening to have a conversation about racism will maybe more likely to go to a Martin Luther King event. They're like, well, let me check this off for the year. And so this is why I really like events. and events that are sponsored by your city that helps bring in people who are not a part of the sort of ideological space which you typically inhabit. And that's how you're able to bring in people of a more diverse, political, cultural persuasion. You can get people involved via media if you're able to get that kind of coverage. In Grants Pass, we had our Martin Luther King Day event, and then in both before and after, we had some really encouraging local news stories where they were able to talk positively about, oh, this event's happening in our community, we're excited to see it grow. And so, yes, the majority of people did not participate in our events, but they are hearing about them and they're learning about them vicariously. And so that's another point of contact for them to learn about the work, is the coverage of them. And so in terms of widening your base of, there's base rallying work and then there's base widening work. And for that base widening work, it involves creating low stuff that are easily accessible and have low entry points. And so strategically, Martin Luther King Day is one of the easiest low entry points to get people into this work, because in 2024, everyone likes him, even though he died with a 32% approval rating. And so utilizing the cultural calendar would be my way of getting people involved in this work who don't particularly participate in it. And I think that, it's not just, so in Coos Bay, the first two Juneteenth events were led by the History Museum, which is a, largely white institution. But the History Museum, creating that foundation of Juneteenth, was what allowed, in this most recent year, Juneteenth to be led by a coalition of local African Americans. And so a lot of this work is creating footholds in the community for individuals of color to be able to climb up. And so there is the necessity for this work happening, largely driven by white people, to help create that foundation that, because I would say in most communities in Oregon are not ready for some of the people of color leadership, and it requires white people bringing more white people into the conversation. And so I have a whole training called Racial Strategies for Racial Justice Organizing. And so there are ways that you can do this strategically. I'm doing a training with, I don't know if you know, Oregon Humanities, May 4th. They have a series of trainings called So Much Together. If you would like to learn more, I suggest you sign up for that training. It's May 4th. It's located somewhere in Portland. But I'm happy to continue this conversation with anyone who wants to talk about some of the strategy about how you actually sort of get this work to grow in a community.
Do we have any more questions, thoughts? Anything online?
One comment was from earlier. More importantly, our BIPOC students would feel and actually be safe in the schools rather than fear being harmed and actually being harmed. I think that was about the Sunset City.
Well, with that, I'd like to, again, thank Taylor and Sarah. Can we just get a round of applause real quick? So, yeah, again, hopefully this is not, well, I know this is not going to be like the last time we all interact, work with each other. But I do want to say that for those in person, Sarah will be signing books. I know some of you brought some. We also have some to give away, possibly with a suggested donation. again, support the work. But in the refreshments room outside. So I think with that, we're going to wrap tonight's presentation. And Taylor, Sarah, thank you again.
I will just say I put little Post-it notes on the table in front of the book table. If you want, I'm happy to write your name in the book, but if you'll just write it down so that I know how to spell it, then I would be happy to sign your books. And yeah, the books were bought by Respond to Racism, yes? Yeah. And so they're being given away, and the suggested donation, I think, is going back to Respond to Racism. So, yeah, just so we're clear on where the money's going. It's going back to the good work.